Philosophy is the prime mover of history, writes Leonard Peikoff. Today we're discussing what this claim means, and how it is so. Welcome to Week 35, the final session of the Objectivism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold, and we'll be reading the Epilogue in Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. It's pages 451 to 460, the duel between Plato and Aristotle. Peikoff writes the following as an application of objectivism to a specialized field, history. And he mentions that there's some other places you could find related material, such as his own book, The Ominous Parallels, and also a new book, which he doesn't mention here, but it's called The Dim Hypothesis, I'd recommend. I might have more to say about both of those books later. And then also Ayn Rand's book, For the New Intellectual, which I'll also have more to say about later. Our next book study will be on that book. So Peikoff writes that Ayn Rand's theory of man leads to a distinctive interpretation of history. By identifying the cause of human action, her theory enables us to discover the factor that shapes men's past and future. If man is the conceptual being, philosophy is the prime mover of history. I read this as a Christian and I think, well, in a sense, yes, it is. Now, in a different sense, God is the prime mover of history. He's the one that has created us. He's the one that has set things in motion. What is it that makes men do things that they do? That would be their beliefs. And that's completely consistent with Christianity. We see out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and those kinds of things. And so within Christianity, we understand that this is true. Your beliefs do shape your life in a certain sense. There's things outside of your control. There are accidents. The primary mover of history is not political power, what natural resources a group of people had. The primary mover has been what they actually believed. And of course, this is consistent with objectivism, because objectivism on any of these topics that we've been looking at over the last almost a whole year now, we've been asking, what is the role of the mind in this or that? And so what is the role of the mind in history? How does the person that thinks, that applies their mind, how does that shape their life? Peikoff writes, a conceptual being is moved by the content of his mind, ultimately by his broadest integrations. Man's actions depend on his values. His values depend on metaphysics. It's going to depend on his epistemology, his fundamental ideas, explicitly or implicitly. His fundamental ideas will be the ruling power in his life. Peikoff writes, by their nature, fundamental ideas spread through a society, influencing every subgroup, transcending differences in occupation, schooling, race, class. While there are some today that may be saying that it is your genes or it is your experiences, living in a certain kind of society has shaped you in a way that is beyond your control. I've seen purported Christians at the Gospel Coalition saying that even in a video this week, that basically you're shaped by your nature or your nurture. That's a determinist view, but that's not what the objectivists say. They say that the ideas that come into society lay the groundwork for how people will think. And to some degree, those ideas are going to shape your choices, depending on if you have an active mind or not. You have a choice here. If you accept them passively, then by default, you will follow the flow. That's for sure. Peikoff writes, the men who are being influenced retain the faculty of volition. But most are innocent of explicit philosophy and do not exercise their power to judge ideas. Unwittingly, they take whatever they are given. Of course, that is what has happened to the church in the last decade or so. If you've been paying attention to the social justice controversy, if you've noticed that churches are rejecting the traditional view on men and women, and that now they are embracing what we call evangelical feminism, the idea that a woman should be the preacher in a church or the pastor in a church. These are the consequences of passive acceptance of the ideas of society. Philosophy first shapes a small subgroup, those whose occupation is concerned with a view of man, of knowledge, of values. In modern times, these are the individuals who move philosophy out of the ivory tower. So someone like Charles Taylor, or someone like Karl Marx, his intellectual ancestor, has the ivory tower approach. They are the fountainhead of a certain set of ideas. And then those ideas promulgate, for example, through research groups like Docent, which writes sermons for Big Eva pastors like J.D. Greear and Ed Litton. And Tim Keller helps write the sermons as well, or maybe he uses Docent in some way. I know he's been associated with him. The point is that a small group of intellectuals create material, and that material gets promoted throughout. It goes from the generals to the sergeants to the privates. The intellectuals, Peikoff writes, count on and use philosophy to create its first concrete expression, a society's culture, including its art, its manners, its science, if any, and its approach to education. The spirit of a culture, in turn, is the source of the trends in politics. We agree with Breitbart's observation that politics is downstream from culture. Not to say that there isn't a reciprocal relationship there as well. It's both. And then Peikoff goes on, the spirit of a culture is the source of trends in politics, and then politics is the source of economics. So eventually, politics controls economics, but culture controls politics. So we agree with Peikoff on all these observations. And of course, in light of what we see in the church today, if you could capture the church, which is one communication channel, if you could capture that and use it to support Marxist ideology, then you would have a shift on how people vote, which means you'd have a shift on economics, which is what we are now seeing in the Great Reset. Peikoff writes, objectivism does not deny that there are many factors. This is the common trend that you hear within academia, is that all history is shaped by many factors. We couldn't be so narrow-minded as to think that it's really just one factor that shapes history. It's many. Whether or not the population is high at a certain time, what the religious beliefs are of a certain group of people, what the natural resources are, what the trade relationships are. The fact that, say, England, right before the Industrial Revolution, had the advantage of being an island nation. It made it so that it was favorable for England to have lots of ships, and it didn't need a huge standing army. These kinds of things. They argue about all these different causes. Of course, there are economic causes. There are psychological, military causes at play in developing a society. These are not the primary. So Peikoff writes, there is no dichotomy between philosophy and the specialized factors. Philosophy is not the only cause of the course of the centuries. It is the ultimate cause. Ultimate, I think, in terms of human agency. I don't think that he's necessarily contradicting the idea that God also shapes history. Of course, he doesn't believe in God, but I can say that in terms of human factors, philosophy is the ultimate cause. So Peikoff goes on, the books of philosophers are the beginning. Step by step, the books turn into motives, passions, statues, politicians, and headlines. So that's the course that we see. It is true. I mean, Karl Marx started as a philosopher of history, and now we are hearing his ideology preached from most churches in the country, most schools. He has shaped the institutions, and as a result, he's now shaping the headlines with food shortages. Philosophy, writes Peikoff, determines essentials, not details. If men act on certain principles and choose not to rethink them, the actors will reach the end result logically inherent in the principles. So it's not to say that we know when or how the ideas will play out, but to the extent that they are embraced, to the extent that the ideas are taken seriously and followed to their logical conclusions, we know the direction. Peikoff now introduces his theory of history, the two sets of ideas that he sees as battling for dominance within history. He says, in order to grasp the role of philosophy in history, one must be able to think philosophically, to see the forest. Whoever sees it knows that history is not the domain of accident. And he writes that for 2 millennia, Western history has been the expression of a philosophic duel. The duelists are Plato and Aristotle. If you've seen the famous painting, there's Aristotle and Plato right in the middle, and they're both holding books. Plato going like this and Aristotle going like this. And it's a debate between those two, and all the other philosophers are either on one side or the other of that debate. Plato is the first thinker to systematize otherworldliness, writes Peikoff. His metaphysics, identified in objectivist terms, upholds the primacy of consciousness, this idea of these ideals. His philosophy is called idealism, kind of like these shapes that are not here on Earth, but that are in some other realm, that are the perfect version of the things that we have. And the things we have on Earth are just the shadows of those shapes. Who knows if this is metaphor? Not clear. In objectivist terms, that's primacy of consciousness, and the epistemology is intrinsicism and mysticism. And so his ethics results in the code of sacrifice. Plato was the first communist. Now Aristotle, who was Plato's devoted student for 20 years, reading on, is the first thinker to systematize worldliness. Once again, I have to qualify, worldliness does not mean embrace of your feelings or sinful indulgences. We're not using the term in the Christian sense there. Worldliness as in, I believe that the world exists, and it's real. So Plato's metaphysics, writes Peikoff, upholds the primacy of existence, his epistemology the validity of reason, his ethics the ideal of personal happiness. So notice the consistency across those branches. If you do believe in the primacy of existence, then you should believe in reason, and you should believe in seeking personal happiness. There were good, intelligent followers of Plato and of Aristotle, and over time, it was actually Plato's ideas that won out, at least in the first centuries after those lived. They lived, I think, in the 300s BC. And so even by the time of Jesus, their ideas were somewhat dominant. Plato's ideas had already become dominant, and within the first 100 years after Jesus, they were becoming more dominant. By the time you get to Augustine, then you get a strong fusion of Plato's philosophy with Christianity, and that was one of Augustine's main accomplishments. That led to the development of the Catholic Church, the way that we see it played out through the rest of church history. So Peikoff writes, the first battle in the historical duel was won decisively by Plato through the work of such disciples as Plotinus, maybe Plotinus, not sure, and Augustine. Now, Peikoff writes, the Dark Ages were dark on principle. Here, I would have qualifications with what he's saying. He's painting with a very broad brush. Dark Ages were not necessarily to be blamed on the effect of either Christianity or Catholicism or Plato. I'm not convinced that that is the most responsible reading. I think that the Dark Ages took place not merely because of that, although there could be some areas where it's partly to blame. As the barbarians were sacking the body of Rome, the church was struggling to annul the last vestiges of its spirit, wrenching the West away from nature, astronomy, philosophy, nudity, pleasure, instilling in men's souls the adoration of eternity with all its temporal consequences. Now, if you are familiar with Augustine, watching Rome fall under crisis, sometimes be sacked by barbarians, Western civilization is falling in the time of Augustine's life. And he's asking himself, why? And how should a Christian think about these things? It's hard to look at that and say the reason why Rome fell was because of Platonism and Christianity. I don't know that that's the reason why Rome fell. That might be the reason why once it fell, it stayed down for quite a long time. There are some connections we could tease out, but this is not essential to the overall argument that Peikoff is making here. We just need to accept with Peikoff that to some extent, the Dark Ages were a time of taking superstition seriously and taking an anti-worldly philosophy seriously. Once it fell, this is the level to which it fell. Peikoff is quoting one historian. He says that the early Christian fathers delighted in such simple self-tortures as hair shirts and failing to wash. Others proceeded to more desperate extremes, such as Ammonius, who tortured his body with a red-hot iron until it was covered with burns. It would not be necessary to dwell on these depressing details if it were not for the fact that the Church erected these appalling practices into a virtue, often canonizing those who practiced them. Margaret Marie Alcoque, I think, sought out rotten fruit and dusty bread to eat. Like many mystics, she suffered from a lifelong thirst, but she decided to allow herself no drink from Thursday to Sunday. And when she did drink, preferred water in which laundry had been washed. She was canonized in 1920. St. Rose ate nothing but a mixture of sheep's gall, bitter herbs, and ashes, vowed herself to chastity at an incredibly early age, for, it is said, yes, there were consequences to Platonism being absorbed by Christianity, and Jacob Brenton and I would speak forcefully against the Gnosticism, the idea of heaven being all the good things versus earth being all the bad things, against the anti-worldliness that we see within Christian history. This idea that we are not fit to live on earth and we shouldn't aim to flourish on earth. Rather, for the New Christian Intellectual, our project is for people who believe in rational Christianity, for those who love their lives and who want a philosophy for living on earth. We can agree with Peikoff that these are problems. By the way, these are problems more specifically with Catholicism. Catholicism took Christian teaching and took it in the wrong direction. So we're not going to defend Catholicism. So then Peikoff describes how Aristotle's works were lost to the West for centuries, which is true. To European society, they were lost, not necessarily to Arab society. But then Thomas Aquinas turned Aristotle loose. We're talking about one of the main influences of Christian history. Aquinas, he was a controversial figure during his life, but eventually his teaching on Aristotle was accepted and embraced. Arab society, for a significant amount of time, had Aristotle even when European society had lost him. This is connected with the flourishing of Arab society. Up until around the time of maybe the 1000s or 1100s, the Arab philosophers, on the basis of Aristotle, had developed a very strong approach to reality-oriented philosophy. Not all that different from some of the things we see in objectivism. And because of that, they began to delve into the sciences and in math, and they were the best the world had to offer at that time. And then the philosophers and the theologians, who were Muslims, of course, began to look at what was being built by this Aristotelian trend, and they said, wait a minute, if the Quran is true, then that conflicts with this. And so then, I think it was Al-Ghazali wrote a treatise called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which he made a philosophical case that philosophy was useless. And after that, all of a sudden, Muslim society, very wealthy, high population, high education society, took a huge turn away from Aristotle. And that led to the rest of Arab history. And the rest of Arab history tended to be much more stagnant. There was not as much development in the sciences. The Muslims took Aristotle seriously until they realized that they wanted to try to take a presuppositionalism seriously. And then they just threw out Aristotle. As Christians looking at presuppositionalism, we have a historical case that we can look at and see what happens if you take precepts seriously. It's one of the reasons why I think there's so much at stake. You will turn into the same thing. You'll basically turn your society back to the Dark Ages. and you'll do it for 1,000 years. Even to this day, much of the Arab world is in the Dark Ages. That's why. The Ayn Rand Institute has several lecture series on the history of philosophy in the Arab world. Peikoff is describing here the effect of Aristotle through Aquinas on Western Europe. Reason, Aquinas taught, is not a handmaiden of faith, but an autonomous faculty which men must use and obey. The physical world is not an insubstantial emanation, but solid and knowable, real. Life is not to be cursed, but to be lived. Within a century, the West was on the threshold of the Renaissance. Peikoff ascribes the development of the Renaissance, a rebirth, a reawakening in art and in humanism, that is, valuing human life, valuing human accomplishments, beauty in the arts, but also technology, an approach to building society that is aggressive. Peikoff ascribes all of that Renaissance shift to Aquinas and to others like Aquinas who were bringing in reason, logic, and of course the Catholic Church had a big part to play in that. Aquinas was a Catholic theologian as well as a philosopher, and so the Catholics and Catholic universities were able to be the promoters of this new set of ideas. If you study the history of logic, you'll find it's inseparable from the work of the Catholic Church. They loved what Aquinas found within Aristotle, and they developed it, they refreshed it, they made it more clear. So now Peikoff goes next, he says, the period from Aquinas through Locke and Newton. So we're talking about a period of, from the 1200s to the 16 and 1700s. A huge period of time. The period from Aquinas through Locke and Newton was a transition at once gingerly and accelerating. The rediscovery of pagan civilization, the outpouring of explorations and inventions, the rise of man-glorifying art and of earthly philosophy, the affirmation of man's individual rights, the integration of earlier leads into the first system of modern science. All of it represents a prodigious effort to throw off the medieval shackles and reorient the Western mind. It was the prologue to a climax, the first unabashedly secular culture since antiquity, the Enlightenment. Once again, thinkers accepted reason as uncontroversial. So he wants to characterize the Enlightenment as being secular. I'm not sure that his case is as strong as he thinks it is. There was certainly a secularizing trend within the Enlightenment. If you look at Denis Diderot, or if you look at Voltaire, sure, they rejected religion. So that some of the primary thinkers of the Enlightenment era were atheists or deists and so on. That said, I'm not sure that that's exactly the way I would characterize the Enlightenment. Moving to the next page, he talks about how salvation as man's goal gave way to the pursuit of happiness on earth. Now, I don't think those things are incompatible, but he's right in his characterization there, that was the shift. Faith and force, as Ayn Rand observed, entail each other. Keep in mind that when they speak of faith, they mean blind faith, not the kind of faith that I advocate. Faith and force entail each other. Rand would say that that fact was exemplified by the feudalism in the medieval centuries, the system in which everyone was in bondage to a certain lord, but then everyone's belief system supported this system. I think that you can argue that those things were connected. But reason and freedom entail each other too, writes Peikoff. The purest example of this fact was the emergence of a new nation in the New World. It was the first time a nation had ever been founded consciously on a philosophic theory. The theory was the principle of rights. I agree with his casting of history. Man, America's founding fathers said in essence, is the rational animal. Therefore, the individual, not the state, is sovereign. Man must be left free to think and to act accordingly. And this resulted in the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration, and in the Constitution that implements it, we see at last the full expression in political terms of the Aristotelian fundamentals. The desire to have a good life, the desire to be able to be free to use your mind in order to achieve it. These are things that were implicit in Aristotle, weren't they? Despite the claims then and since about its Judeo-Christian roots, writes Peikoff, the United States with its unique system of government could not have been founded on any philosophically different period. The new nation would have been inconceivable in the 17th century under the Puritans, to say nothing of the 12th. Again, when we get into the assessment, here we just have some difficulties with Peikoff, because there's no doubt that the American founders, the thinkers and writers around the time of the American founding and in the 100 years before, many of them were explicitly Christian. Or if not explicitly Protestant, many of them were explicitly favorable toward at least the ethical teachings of the Bible. They would have said that they believed in the Judeo-Christian traditions. If he wants to argue that the American government would not have been formed under the Puritans, historically he has a strong case for that, because actually they first tried communism, the Puritans, and then they abandoned it. So there's just a lot of yes, but when I read this. The Puritans tried communism, they failed, they tried a capitalist system, it succeeded. It's because of the Puritans and because of other people in the country at that time working out what it takes to survive that we got the kind of system that we had. It wasn't just because of John Locke, but it was also because of practical experience. I think he's not giving credit to the Christians for being the ones that made the discoveries. This is 456. The combination of reason and freedom is potent. In the 19th century, it led to the Industrial Revolution, to romantic art, and to an authentic goodwill among men. It led to an unprecedented burst of wealth, beauty, happiness. Wherever they looked, people saw a smiling present and a radiant future. The idea of continuous improvement came to be taken for granted as though it were an axiom. Progress, people thought, is now automatic and inevitable. This is a correct characterization of the 1800s about what was, for the most part, the direction of society. Peikoff writes, since the Renaissance, the anti-Aristotelian forces had been regrouping. In the 17th century, Descartes planted Platonism once again at the base of philosophy. Remember Descartes, the Catholic autodidact philosopher? René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. He set out to prove that the world exists by the approach called the prior certainty of consciousness. He tried to base his conviction that the world exists on the assumption that his consciousness exists, which is backward from the way Rand would do it. It's a Platonist approach. Descartes planted Platonism at the base of philosophy. Thanks to their intrinsicist element, the Aristotelians had always been vulnerable to attack. Above all, they were vulnerable in two crucial areas, the theory of concepts and the validation of ethics. So Aristotle had good things to say about ethics, but he didn't know how to validate it. And Aristotle's theory of concepts was also imperfect, as we've discussed in previous weeks. So that set the stage for the Aristotelians to lose the culture battle, to lose the battle for the institutions. And then Peikoff goes on, the thinker who ended the Enlightenment and laid the foundation for the 20th century, think about the world wars, Nazism, Soviet Russia, that thinker was Immanuel Kant. We're talking about somebody who lived through the time of the American Revolution. He lived in Königsberg, then Germany, now it's Russia, the very far east in Germany. And Immanuel Kant set out to solve what he thought were the contradictions in philosophy at the time, especially the problem of concepts. And so Kant held we're going to need a new metaphysics and a new epistemology. The metaphysics identified in objectivist terms as the primacy of consciousness in a social variant. In other words, whatever everybody accepts as true, that's what we will treat as true. And you can see that today if you read Carl Trueman in his book Against Individualism. What's it called? Carl Trueman is Kantian, and Charles Taylor is Kantian, and Timothy Keller. The intellectual life of evangelical Christianity is shaped by Immanuel Kant, by this collectivist version of the primacy of consciousness theory. If you're curious, how so? The book to check out on that would be The Ominous Parallels by Leonard Peikoff. So he's well suited for this. According to Kant, the epistemology should be social subjectivism and its corollary, skepticism. You'll hear that in Keller a lot. Now, this approach left Kant free to declare as beyond challenge the essence of the intrinsicist ethics. So because you can't prove me wrong, I'm just going to go ahead and assert all these ethical theories and ask me, well, how is it logical? Then I've already got a plan for explaining to you why logic doesn't matter and why you can't know things. So let's talk about this intrinsicist duty ethics of Kant. This means imperatives issued by reality itself, by noumenal reality, which is the higher reality which we don't have any access to. Not the phenomenal reality that we see, but the noumenal one. Kind of like Plato, right? When Kant's new approach took over Western philosophy, writes Peikoff, as it did within decades, duty to the noumenal world became instead duty to the group or the state, which we see in Hegel, who was an absolute statist, and then his immediate follower, Marx. Marx wrote within a decade of the death of Hegel and studied at the same university that Hegel was at. So it's a direct lineage from Kant to Hegel to Marx. Peikoff describes Kant's revolution here as turning away from observations of reality and turning toward an idealism. We call it German idealism. By the way, who else is a German idealist? Cornelius Van Til grew up learning the language and the ideas of German idealism. And so he has a Christianized cleanup job of German idealism. Unfortunately, he doesn't reject all of their false premises. And to the extent that he embraces their false premises, he ends up becoming very much like them. Kant picked up the ideas of Plato, but he made them less mixed and more consistent. Plato had said, you should sacrifice your desires to gain a reward. Your proper goal, even the saints would have said, would be happiness, your own happiness, but to be obtained in the next life. Whereas Kant is different. Kant is going to say that man's proper goal is not happiness, not in this life, not in the next. Kant calls man the radically evil creature. That's a direct quote. And he says that the radically evil creature should sacrifice his desires from duty as an end in itself. Kant is the first philosopher in history, writes Peikoff, to reject reality, thought, and values not for the sake of some higher version of them, but for the sake of the rejection.
Did you say that Kant believes humans are radically evil?
He calls him the radically evil creature, yeah. That question of whether we're basically good, I think that human beings are basically good, but that we have been touched by depravity in all of our different areas of our being. So the doctrine of total depravity doesn't mean that we are, like as Kant would say, radically evil. No, it means that we are comprehensively touched by evil, comprehensively corrupted in all of our different aspects. That doesn't mean that we should go squishing other people like bugs. Like, I think of my two kids. All of their different faculties have been touched by sin. But when I look at them, I don't see that's mainly an evil thing. No, I see that's mainly a good thing that has been corrupted. But partially. They're essentially good. They still have the image of God, and they are still essentially what Adam and Eve were when God looked at them and said it's very good. I would disagree with Kant's characterization that these are radically evil creatures. And within the Christian discourse, this idea of describing yourself as a worm, like we have in some of the hymns, would Jesus die for such a worm as I? I affirm that in the ethical sense. The kind of decisions and sins that I've done in the past, they would make me a worm compared to his goodness.
Right.
That's true. I mean, I can affirm that. Peikoff writes next, he says that Kant is the first philosopher in history to reject reality, thought, values, not for the sake of some higher version, but for the sake of the rejection. Then he writes, the result of Plato's approach was a form of adoration, but the result of Kant was the hatred of the good for being the good. Plato was pointing to something higher. Kant was just obsessed with the fact that we are lower. The hatred took shape in a culture of nihilism. So modern intellectuals are comparable to a psychopath who murders for kicks, says Peikoff. They seek the thrill of the new, and the new to them is the negative. The new is obliteration. And this is what we see in modern art, and in the discussions that we did over the last 2 weeks, we saw that. So Peikoff then writes, thus the uniqueness of the century behind us. And I'll quote him at length here because this is powerful. He says, philosophy gleefully rid of system building. Education based on a theory that cognition is harmful. That would be John Dewey's theory. Science boastful of its inability to understand. That would be the theory of the paradigm shifts that come every couple hundred years, where science is a history of debunked theories. Art, which expelled beauty. Literature, which flaunted anti-heroes. Language liberated from syntax, which would be the literary styles of the 20th century. Verse, free of meter, which is modern poetry, if you look on Instagram, for the poets of Instagram. Non-representational painting, if you think of Jackson Pollock. Atonal music, Schoenberg, unconscious psychology, deconstruction in literary criticism, indeterminacy as the new depth in physics, incompleteness as the revelation in mathematics, a void everywhere that was acclaimed by the avant-garde with a metaphysical chuckle. And if you want more detail on those trends, they're mapped out in 2 of Peikoff's books, which I'll mention more in detail later. Peikoff is a philosopher of history, and that's where he's most excellent. Peikoff goes on, Kant, surrounded by the Enlightenment, did not develop the political implications of his philosophy. Kant was actually pro-American Revolution. Interesting note there. But the way this works historically is people come up with a theory, a new innovative theory, and they don't understand all of the implications of its theory, but their immediate followers do. Their immediate followers will take it to the consistent conclusion. Kant's followers had no trouble seeing his point. Peikoff lists Fichte, Hegel, Marx, and Bismarck, another important figure in German history. They drew the conclusion. These figures led to what Peikoff calls the most passionately anti-freedom movements in history. Communism and fascism. By fascism, we're talking about what happened in the Nazi Party in Germany, otherwise known as National Socialism. It also led to other welfare statist antecedents and kin, as we see developing in Great Britain and in the United States and throughout South America, etc. Modern statism emanated as it had to from the land of the poets and the philosophers. The reason is not the innate depravity of the Germans, but the nature of their premier philosopher, Kant. Peikoff writes, statism cannot sustain an industrial civilization. Nihilism cannot abide it. Thus we have the growing attacks in the 20th century against technology. This actually started, this anti-technology, anti-industrial concept that we now see in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. That was present in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, if you can believe it. They actually invented the hippies. Hippies came from Germany. The long-haired stereotype hippie with a guitar, that was a German thing before it was an American thing. By the way, why do hippies like driving the little VW buses? It was a German trend. It's weird to think. Peikoff documents that in his Ominous Parallels book. What we have now in the 20th century and in the 21st century, this anti-industrial mindset where we want to sacrifice everything for the endangered species. to save every species except for human beings, apparently. This we see today in the news with electrical shortages, where we can't even have air conditioning in our houses anymore because we don't invest in the technology, because we don't believe in this technology anymore. And at the same time, we're telling people to buy electric vehicles, but then we're telling them don't charge them. Peikoff summarizes, Ayn Rand is to Aristotle what Kant is to Plato. Both sides of the perennial duel, in their pure form, have been finally made explicit. He writes that Kant's philosophy is Platonism without paganism. Plato the pagan, take away his paganism and just make him secular. Eventually you get the outworkings of Kant. But then he writes Ayn Rand's philosophy as Aristotelianism without Platonism. Try to wrap your mind around that. Aristotle has some good stuff, but he was mixed with Plato. Take away the Platonism and just take the pure essence of what Aristotle was arguing, and that's actually what Ayn Rand is arguing. Peikoff writes, Kant as a cultural power is dead. Kant is dead in academic philosophy. The subject has effectively expired under his tutelage. Now that's one of my favorite lines in all of Peikoff's writing. The subject of philosophy has expired under Kant's tutelage. This collapse is a negative, it's not a positive. There's nothing to fill the void. People are just coasting now in academia. Peikoff writes, the only man who can stave off another dark ages is the father of the Enlightenment. And by this he means Aristotle. A return to logic and a return to reality and reason. Now, as a Christian, I hear this and I think, wow, the only man who can save the world is, and I'm thinking it's supposed to be Jesus. But he says Aristotle. Is there some sense in which he's right? I'll leave it to you to decide that. Is there a sense in which life on earth requires Aristotle? Would Jesus even disagree with that? Jesus, the one who insisted that his listeners observe logic strictly. As you can see in Luke 12, he insists that you think. And don't be a hypocrite about your ability to follow logical syllogisms. Peikoff rejects this idea that we should love God. He promotes the idea that we should love the good for being the good. And with that, I agree. Peikoff says, some remnant of love still survives in the West. Above all, it survives in the people of America, which, despite its decline, is still the leader and beacon of the world, and this is grounds for hope. A nation, however, is shaped ultimately not by its people, but by its intellectuals. This is the ground for fear, unless some new intellectuals, as Rand called them, can be created. And now we're on the last page of Peikoff's book. Peikoff writes, Ayn Rand's ideas would resolve the contradiction that has been tearing apart the land of the free, the contradiction between its ethics and its politics. The result would not be America as it is, or even as it once was, but the grandeur of a romantic pinnacle, America as it might be and ought to be. The vision that Peikoff has given in this book would show us how to resolve the conflicts inherent within the conservatives, because they embrace collectivism still. We need the kind of arguments that this book offers. To the end of her life, Ayn Rand upheld her distinctive benevolent universe premise. The good, she maintained, can be achieved. It is real, it is possible, it is yours. So long as there is no censorship, she taught, there is a chance for persuasion to succeed. If no definite prediction can be made, she taught, then in reason only one action is proper, to go on fighting for reason. And so Peikoff wraps up his book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, by pointing out, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. That's a quote from Spinoza. Since human values are not automatic, his statement is undeniable, says Peikoff. But in another respect, and this is Ayn Rand's unique perspective, the task ahead is not difficult. To save the world is the simplest thing in the world. All one has to do is think. New York City and South Laguna, California, 1984 through 1990. Decades ago, Leonard Peikoff offered this to the world, and it has not yet been accepted by most of the world. It has not even been encountered by most of the church. But what do we think about this? Can we save the world by thinking? I will offer my thoughts on that in just a moment. But first, I want to point you to some of the things that Peikoff has written beside this book, because he has two other major works. And they're outstanding, they're worth your study. There's a book that he wrote while Ayn Rand was still alive, and it was called The Ominous Parallels. And Ayn Rand endorsed the book. She helped him with the work on the book. So let me read you the publisher's blurb, because I want you to be aware of this. It's been influential on me, and I think that you should consider studying it. Peikoff demonstrates how far America has been detoured from its original path and led down the same road that Germany followed to Nazism. Self-sacrifice, Oriental mysticism, and radical, quote, truth. The public good, doing one's duty. These are among the seductive catchphrases that Leonard Peikoff dissects, examining the kind of philosophy they symbolize, the type of thinking that lured Germany to its doom, and that he says is now prevalent in the United States. Here is a frightening look at where America may be heading, a clarion call for all who are concerned about preserving our right to individual freedom. So if you want to understand how the ideas of Kant filtered into society through the German philosophers, the German thinkers in the 1800s and eventually the 1900s, That's the go-to source for that. And his case is strong. Within American culture, starting around the 70s and 80s, you see a lot of patterns similar to what you saw in the early 20th century, leading up to the Weimar Republic and then later to the Nazi Third Reich. I'll read even just a little bit more about that book to give you some picture. This is from a customer review on Amazon. I just want to quote it. It says, "The Ominous Parallels is a unique and revolutionary intellectual work by Dr. Peikoff, illustrating the role of philosophical ideas in shaping society and history, using Plato, Kant, and Hegel as the antipodes of Aristotle. He explains how their theories, in opposition to reason, reality, and individualism, served as the framework for the Third Reich. Hitler sought obedient followers to carry out his ordained will and impose on the world. Dr. Peikoff illustrates how he accomplished this." It has a lot to do with epistemology. If you want to know the direction that the US is on right now, and you want to know the kind of changes you can expect, you need to look at German history, because it's almost like history itself is just taking notes on what happened in Germany and it's playing out right now. Now, there's one other book that I'll recommend from Leonard Peikoff, and that is his more recent book called The Dim Hypothesis. Here's the publisher's blurb about that one. "In this far-reaching study, Peikoff identifies the three methods people use to integrate concrete data into a whole, as when connecting diverse experiments by a scientific theory, or separate laws into a constitution, or single events into a story." So this is Peikoff's work on integration. What is intellectual integration? The first method, in which data is integrated through rational means, he calls integration. The second, which employs non-rational means, he calls misintegration. The third is disintegration, which is nihilism, the desire to tear things apart. In the Dim Hypothesis, Peikoff demonstrates the power of these three methods in shaping the West by using the categories to examine the culturally representative fields of literature, physics, education, and politics. 3 different methods, 4 different branches of human achievement, so 12 different analyses. And he does it by historical periods. It stretches out and it becomes this massive work. He looks at the history of these different aspects. His analysis illustrates how the historical trends in each field have been dominated by one of these 3 categories, not only today, but during the whole progression of Western culture beginning in ancient Greece. Extrapolating from the historical pattern he identifies, Peikoff concludes by explaining why the lights in the West are going out, and predicts the most likely future of the United States. So this is one of the key things that influences me. I read this before I started for the New Christian Intellectual, and I realized his hypothesis about what's going to happen next in American history, I agree with it, and it's the thing that we need to fight against. And his hypothesis is that the theonomists are going to join with the anti-industrialists, also with the woke. Now imagine if you had a theocratic version of wokeism and anti-industrialism. Imagine if you had a Christian version of socialism. That's the direction that America is going, and FTNCI exists to tell the church, stop. Get back to reality. This is the pattern. If we follow this, we are going to have a socialist theocracy. So that's Leonard Peikoff's Dim Hypothesis, and it's absolutely necessary to understand where we are going. Now, we're getting to the end of our session. This is the last of our 35 weeks together. I hope that you have found as much value in this material as I have found. If you're looking for more of this kind of thing, I would like to ask you to join us for our next book study. We're going to look at Ayn Rand's book, For the New Intellectual. We're going to divide the book into 3 parts, and it will be a sprint through one part, and then 2 weeks break, and then another sprint, and so on. We'll just be using that time to look at the first 57 pages of that book. It's a single speech. The speech is also called For the New Intellectual, so it's a book and it's also the name of the title essay. So in this essay, Rand offers a framework for understanding the role of ideas in history. I thought it was a good segue because we've just discussed that here in Peikoff's book. We can actually look and see what Rand had to say about the same topic. She's going to offer a metaphor of an ongoing struggle between 2 different types of men. Sometimes a fight between these 2 types of men, and sometimes an alliance between them. And the 2 kinds of men are Attila and the witch doctor, the mystics of muscle and the mystics of the mind. This is a short summary of that book. In response to the practical problems of the 1960s, problems similar to those we face today, many public figures were calling for a retreat from intellectual concerns in favor of blind tradition and range-of-the-moment pragmatism. Does that sound similar to what we see today? Rand rejected this approach. She held that abstract ideas are man's basic means of dealing with practical life. They enable him to understand concrete issues, to evaluate them, and to act successfully to deal with them. The problem with Western civilization, she held, was not that it was too intellectual, but that many of its intellectuals accepted and propagated fundamentally wrong ideas. What the world needs urgently, she said, are new intellectuals, and so that gets us into her essay. By the way, why do you think we call our podcast For the New Christian Intellectual? It's in homage to her work on this topic. You can find that at christianintellectual.com/intellectual. As we bring this 35 expansive amount of sessions to a close, I would like to offer some comments on the work that we've done. In January this year, I gave some reasons for doing a detailed study of Ayn Rand's thought. I asked, why would we want to have a strong understanding of Rand's system of principles, her philosophy of objectivism? If you've followed these videos across these many weeks, you now have a comprehensive answer to that question. You understand what Rand discovered about many philosophical topics, from the axioms, concepts, logic, and demonstration, to proper motivation and values for life, the meaning of the virtues, your social obligations, what you do and do not owe to other people, your political rights, what to look for in good art. You become a student of truth and of philosophy. Now, when I say a student of truth, I don't just mean particular truths, but you've looked in depth at what does it mean to say that something is true. You're a student of the very concept of truth. You now know why careful thought on philosophical topics is needed, and you know the fruit that this work brings, the distinct sense of clarity and moral purpose that you gain in proportion to your study. You know the answer to the question, what is philosophy? And why do we all need philosophy? We have looked at the questions of the most basic kind. We have outlined a philosophical system. We've actually outlined two. Because as we've been going through Rand's belief system, we've also been making our own qualifications. And so I've been naming my philosophical system, which is not the same as Rand's, but very much similar. Now, these discussions, they have not contained all of my most important beliefs. Not at all. These might be Rand's most important beliefs. But as a Christian, as a believer in Scripture, I believe that theology also has a place in life, and that you don't have a full human flourishing life unless you have good theology, not just philosophy. But as far as the key philosophical positions, we have now named them. In showing what an integrated belief system is, we have, I hope, made a compelling case for why holding an integrated belief system in an organized way is necessary for life. And so, with Ayn Rand as our capable guide, we've accomplished what philosophy sets out to do. We have answered the questions that confront all people at all times as a starting foundation to life, such as, where am I? How do I know? What should I do? These basic questions, you can't even begin to think about God and moral duties until you start answering those. We've been approaching these questions in a principled way, and principles as such have actually been the main topic of our study for these 8 months. A principled life, an honest approach to truth. That's what we're seeking. And that's what we found. We found the foundation. And now I say foundation because our discussions have not reached the level of a treatise on ethical living. That would be a different project. And we've not looked in detail about my Christian beliefs, about Christianity, what Scripture has to say. We've looked at natural revelation. We've looked at what can be known by nature. Natural revelation only takes us so far in understanding how to live, but by attending to natural revelation, we've discovered some things that are indispensable. The basic and universal principles that we need in order to have a sound method of thought. The methods of logic, the methods of rightly handling concepts are things that we are going to need. We need them for all of life. We need them today. We need them each year of our lives. We need them even when we approach the question of Scripture and theology. Knowledge of the methods of concepts, the methods of logic, precedes sound knowledge of even something as important as Scripture. Natural revelation is part of God's revelation. It is, after all, revelation, and it is authoritative. Natural revelation is the first part of God's revelation. It is from natural revelation, from the human study of it, from philosophy, that we learn the methods that we need even to approach Scripture, even to approach theology. Now, Christians and churches today are weak in the area of principled thinking. That is too clear. Why? It is exactly because they have neglected natural revelation and the study of it, philosophy. This one weakness accounts for and connects with most of the terrible things that are happening in churches in America at this pivotal moment. Christians lack and they need the skill of truth. They need the skill of principle. They need the skill of thinking. Now, not everyone has to be a philosopher, but everyone will benefit from being in a society in which good philosophy is the dominant force. Teacher, pastor, leader, get this skill. Get wisdom. With all of your getting, get wisdom. Learn to think in principle. And that means form your principles carefully and hold them in an integrated way. System building? Yes. Ideology? Yes. And if you say that ideology is bad, well then I don't like your ideology on that. That's an ideology too. As a human being, you do not have the choice about whether you're going to integrate knowledge, whether you're going to have an ideology. You only have a choice about whether it's going to be well integrated or poorly integrated. This is what we read from Ayn Rand in our first week, those 8 months ago. She wrote, "A philosophic system is an integrated view of existence." As a human being, you have no choice about the fact that you need a philosophy. Your only choice is whether you define your philosophy by a conscious, rational, disciplined process of thought and scrupulously logical deliberation, or let your subconscious accumulated junk heap of unwarranted conclusions, false generalizations, undefined contradictions, undigested slogans, unidentified wishes, doubts, and fears, thrown together by chance but integrated by your subconscious into a kind of mongrel philosophy and fused into a single solid weight, self-doubt, like a ball and chain in the place where your mind's wings should have grown. That's what she writes in Philosophy Who Needs It. That summarizes the alternatives that we have. We need philosophy. Yes, even Christians need philosophy if they want to live and succeed on earth to the greatest extent within what God has given to them. So in these weeks, we've offered our own thoughts on where Ayn Rand was sometimes mistaken, but where her arguments were right, and indeed where they were right in ways that are precise and powerful. In Ayn Rand's well-articulated approach to the 5 branches of philosophy, we find rich insights, arguments that are true, that are neglected, that are desperately needed in the world today. In discussing this project with Jacob Brutton several weeks ago, I pointed out to him, when we finish this book study, I'm going to finally have said everything I want to say to the world. Everything. I've covered all the main issues that motivated me to start writing in the first place. I mean, I didn't have to be a writer. I could have been a music teacher, could have done other things. But I decided I wanted to devote my career to writing. Why? This is why. You now have the answer. I've said it. It was 20 years ago that I first read a book by Ayn Rand. The book was The Fountainhead. I was only 18 at that time. Now, for 12 years after that, so from 18 to 30, I studied Ayn Rand's belief system. I probably put 2,000 hours into studying every lecture I could get my hands on, every book I could get my hands on. I studied Rand's belief system and I integrated it. And I challenged my own belief system and changed it where needed. Because I believe in the sanctity of truth. I came to the conviction over those years that Christians could benefit from an encounter with Rand's ideas, and that I wanted to have a personal role in bringing about that. But I had to be sure. Most people would say it's irresponsible to do such a thing. So 8 years ago, I earned a degree from one of the most influential, purportedly conservative seminaries in the world. I went to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, under Albert Mohler. I wanted to know what the best pastors, professional academics, and experts in the Christian world knew, and how they thought. I wanted to know if I was missing something before I would go speak about Ayn Rand. I had found value in Rand. Clearly, these people had not. They reject most of her main points. They would reject them even if they heard them from somebody else that was not an atheist. I paid attention to what they said. You know, the one who presents his case first seems right, but then another comes and presents his case. Let's find out. So I studied their belief system. I heard what they had to say about logic. I heard what they had to say about non-contradiction. I heard what they had to say about certainty. Turns out that they were more influenced by the French postmoderns than by Aristotle. So when I graduated, I knew what I had to do. I was ready, and I started writing online the same year that I graduated. And from the beginning, my goal has been to show Christians how a sound philosophy, a Christian philosophy similar in character to Ayn Rand's Objectivism, will make us better Christians and better able to fight against the spirit of the age. So this is what I have been doing for the last 8 years since I graduated. Jacob Brutton and I have found a decent amount of success so far in learning how to communicate these philosophic ideas, to grow a hearing for them, and also even to grow financial support for this work. Now, I do not call my philosophy Christian objectivism. I just call it sound philosophy, a philosophy of objectivity. This is the philosophy that Christians need in order to counter the wickedness in churches today. Now, philosophy is not the only thing in life. It is one important thing in life, and it is one thing that I know that Christians lack. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that Christians discover. They need the enrichment of philosophy. I can proudly say, as of today, I have laid the foundation of that life's work. If my life were ever to be cut short, I would know that I have already explained how I see the world, and I have offered my reasons in a way that my own children, at least, and perhaps my friends, perhaps a wider range of people, can engage with these ideas and come to benefit from them. So with the conclusion of this book study, Jacob Brutton and I are ready to move into a season of more aggressively working to popularize these distinct beliefs. We're going to be publishing multiple books. We're going to be organizing events, either online or, if God wills, in person. The intellectual foundation is now laid. The questions have been answered. And now we can build upward. We will create a case for these objective values that is more difficult to ignore. And our goal is nothing less than the total transformation of American society, and especially American churches. Mindless, irresponsible, cowardly pastors must be corrected and expelled. Now, this is a goal that no single Christian can accomplish. But from the power of the argumentation and from the power of these ideas that you've seen in the past months, I can say of this I am certain, when these ideas gain a fair hearing, they will spread. And when they spread, they will make the world a better place, to whatever extent. The major unknown here is only speed. How many decades or lifetimes is it going to take for a sound philosophy to become dominant in the world? God only knows. But we work for that day, and we also work for the joy of the work itself. And most of all, we work for the joy that is set before us. In Christ's return, when God willing, we will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Now, unlike the objectivists, at FTNCI, we don't believe that history is only in man's hands. We believe that God has his plans, and we don't know a lot about them. So let's talk about the future. Let's talk about what does FTNCI say about eschatology and about what is to come. I agree with Peikoff's theory. I agree with Peikoff's warning about the danger of totalitarian dictatorship and of a Christian conservative variety. That's why we spend just as much time critiquing the white identitarians and the national conservatives as we do the wokeists. But what does the Bible say about the end times? Is postmillennialism true? Is premillennialism or awe? Here's what I'll say about that. At FTNCI, we do not have a strong conviction that we would want to promote. I'll tell you, my personal view is premillennial, and I think Jacob's is as well. But we do have an important conviction about eschatology. For the most part, we think it's poor method to look at the news to get your eschatology. I don't know that that's good hermeneutics. For the most part, we think it is poor method to look at the news to figure out what the Bible is saying. And we do not believe that our observations about the news and world events should typically have much influence on what we understand the text of the Bible to mean. I mean, when you see Jesus coming and that's reported in the news, that'll be cause. Until then, the Bible speaks clearly enough. It speaks more clearly about the future of mankind than the last couple of decades of news speaks about the future. The text needs to be understood based on sound hermeneutical principles, not speculation about whether the world is getting better or worse based on current events. We do not know how long the future will be. We do not know what it's going to take, if it's even possible to build a Christendom. But we do know that it is worthwhile to live faithfully. And living faithfully means living in light of the possibility that Christ might return tomorrow for his people. Or he might return in 500 years. So we do not know when the end of the age will be. We are not even sure how it will be. But we do know the Great Commission. So let's talk about this. I want to end our discussion of objectivism by talking about the truth that Ayn Rand avoided to her peril. As Christians, we were given by Jesus Christ the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18-20. And Jesus said unto them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." That's where the objectivists are wrong. He says, "Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." That's the kind of eschatology that we need. We need to know that that is our task and that that is his promise. A disciple of Jesus is someone who has heard this and has heard the gospel and believed the gospel and believed Jesus' teaching as well. If there are any atheists or non-Christians that are going to listen to this recording at some point, I want you to know the key teaching within Jesus' teaching is called the gospel. It's his good news to us. And I want you to know what that gospel is. Jesus, God incarnate, was crucified, he was buried, he rose again, he appeared to Peter and the other disciples, and then to a great number. We read in 1 Corinthians 15:1-5 that there was a great number of witnesses. And so we believe on the basis of the testimony of those witnesses. That's objective. We believe that Jesus ascended into heaven, that he'll be coming back to earth someday to rule his people as he promised he would. In Romans 4:25, we read, Jesus was crucified for our sins and raised for our justification. In Acts 17, we read, God now commands everyone everywhere to repent of their sins and to turn to him. So those who repent of their sins, who believe in the saving work of Jesus, will be adopted into his family. They will be resurrected in the end times and live with him forever in heaven. Hell is a real place. It is a place of eternal punishment for those who persist in being enemies of God. God is a rational egoist. His creation has rebelled against him. He is within his moral rights to treat men with justice. We can approach God only as penitent sinners, asking only not for justice, but for mercy. Only through trusting the work of Jesus Christ. This is not blind trust, as the objectivists would try to strawman us. It is a reasonable trust. It's reasonable to know that God exists, though many might deny it. The world itself testifies by its nature to there being a creator. It is reasonable to believe in the account of Christianity, the account that it gives of who we are as people. Your own conscience testifies against you. You are a person who sins. You are a person who needs forgiveness from the perfect judge. Your heart knows that. Turn. I call you, Leonard Peikoff, and all of your followers. Turn away from your rebellion against God today. Tomorrow is not promised to you. You should ask God to help you face your doubts honestly. You should ask Him to give you the gift that only comes from Him, and that is the ability to place your trust fully in Him. We call it faith. If that word is confusing to you because you think it's blind faith, place your trust in Him on the basis of the best that your mind can do approaching the truth. Become a disciple not of Ayn Rand, but of Jesus Christ. For those who are already Christians, For the New Christian Intellectual, we are aiming to be part of fulfilling the Great Commission. Our role in that is developing Christian disciples who are skilled in philosophy, to better understand and observe what our Lord has commanded. We want to fill the world with Christians who are skilled in the art of careful moral reasoning and careful political reasoning, because these are areas where the church is clearly on its face right now. We aim to give philosophical subtlety a good name in the church, once again. Unlike those who typically represent Christianity from stages now or from podcasts or books, our goal is not to speak to sheep that are uninterested in thinking. We want to speak to explicitly rational Christians, Christians who love their own lives. We want to fill the world with rational Christians. And we believe our project is uniquely suited to do that through teaching philosophy. So we encourage you, consider supporting our project. You could become a donor at christianintellectual.com/Patreon and make use of the resources that we have. Now, if you donate, where does that money go? That is going to go to pay us for the time it takes that we could be doing other things. Time to create resources like this, also costs of technology and costs of marketing and promoting. We are taking those funds that people donate and we are using them to get seen by an ever-growing number of people and to run social media pages, email newsletter, video channel, podcast. Also publishing and promoting books. These are the things where that money will go. Your donation will allow us to create the essential presentations needed to win people to the message that we have. For example, books are way more permanent than the kind of things that we could do on a podcast. Books have a big chance of helping people embrace the ideas. Most Christians today would agree that there is a crisis. And our cultural landscape is not looking good. But there is also a crisis within the church in our era. There is a failure to stand up for the truth. There's a failure to fight the totalitarian trends that are coming from both the left and the right. What we offer For the New Christian Intellectual is a solution in the form of intellectual ammunition for living, for fighting, for becoming an activist. We show how to restore a vision for our country that is consistent with how America was founded and that made America prosperous, that made it good, to the extent that it has been those things. So I want to point out this is an opportunity as the lights of the West are going out. FTNCI is a beacon that shines more brightly by contrast. It is a beacon in the fog. It is an aid to help you find mental clarity and to help you find community, to find those who have similar convictions. So make use of this resource that we've created. FTNCI, it means for the New Christian Intellectual. And by this, I mean for you. You are the New Christian Intellectual. The New Christian Intellectuals are anyone who take philosophy seriously and who get philosophy right in essential terms and who follow the Lord. Will we see a renaissance in our time? That's a question that Ayn Rand asked. And she was speaking of a revitalization, a renaissance in literature. It goes more broadly than that. Her answer was, I don't know. What I do know is this: anyone who fights for the future lives in it today. Thank you for joining us for the Objectivism Book Study. I am Cody Leibold, wishing you God's blessings, and may you always have good premises.